Hello ladies and gentle ladies, welcome back to another Minecraft modding tutorial for Fabric 1.21.1, and in this tutorial we're going to be covering a dynamic item renderer. So effectively this will allow us to have the item for our block entity renderers be rendered inside your hand, inside a GUI, on the ground as like an item entity, and in all of those different states. So that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. It is going to be super simple, and this is actually a very powerful thing that you can then use later on if you want to do maybe custom rendering for your items. Then you can do that. However, we're just going to render a very basic dynamic item renderer for one of our block entities, which is the chest one, and that will be it. So this is going to be a super simple tutorial, so let's just get started. So the first thing we're going to want to go ahead and do is go into our source client Java, and inside of the renderer package we're going to create a new class. Now I am going to call this class example mod dynamic item renderer, as we only want one of these per mod, because that just makes it so much simpler for us to handle. Now this is actually a renderer, not a render, and this class is going to go ahead and implement dynamic item renderer, and that is going to come from built-in item renderer registry dynamic item renderer. Now all we need to do is we need to implement the method, which is the render method, which will be used to obviously render it. And we're also going to need to create a couple fields in here just to save us a little bit of time. So we're going to create a private final Minecraft client, and I'm just going to call this the client, and that'll be equal to Minecraft client.get instance. The other thing that we're going to want to go ahead and do is we're going to create an instance field. So I'm just going to type PRSF, which is private static final, and then I'm going to do example mod dynamic item renderer. I'm going to call this instance will be equal to a new example mod dynamic item renderer. Then the other thing I'm just going to do after the client is I'm going to do a private final block entity render dispatcher, which is going to be the block entity render dispatcher will be equal to client dot get block entity render dispatcher. That'll just save us a little bit of computation from when we do our render method. So now let's go ahead and quickly register this for our block entity item. So let's go into our main client class, and at the very bottom I'm going to create a new section for dynamic item renderers. Now the important thing to note about these is even though we may only have one class for all our item renderers, we do need to still go ahead and register this for each of the items that we want to have these renderers. So let's go ahead and do that. So how we do this is using the built-in item renderer registry dot instance dot register. Now this will first take in the item or the block that we want to register the dynamic item renderer for. So for us that is going to be block init dot example inventory block, and then the second parameter here is going to be the actual dynamic item renderer instance, which is going to be nice and simple since we just created that. So that is going to be example mod dynamic item renderer dot instance. And I did accidentally make this private. This is meant to be a public instance because otherwise that's completely useless to us. And that is it. So obviously once you have any more items you want to add to this, you can go ahead and just add them here. So you just keep calling this method for each of the ones that you want. So each of the blocks, each of the items, etc, etc. As I say in this tutorial, we're just going to do a block, but you can figure out an item. It's relatively simple. If you want to look at the vanilla implementations, you can go ahead and just look up built-in model item renderer class, and inside of here you'll see all of the vanilla instances. So you have, for example, skulls, you have banners, you have beds, you have conduits, chests, ender chest, trap chest, decorated pots, you've got shulker boxes, you've got shields, and you also have a trident as well. So you can see all of the vanilla implementations there. If you want to reuse any of those components or you want to do something similar, then I highly recommend you use vanilla as a reference. And really that goes the same with everything you want to do in modding. So now let's go ahead and actually render this for our block entity. So what we need to do, and this is going to be a bit weird, but we need to create an instance of our block entity. Even though we don't actually want our block entity, it needs to have an instance, and that is so that we can actually render that instance. So it will call the render method of our block entity, and that will happen without the block entity ticking or anything like that. So what we're going to do, and this is going to be super simple, is we're going to create a private final example inventory block entity, and I'm going to call this example inventory block entity is equal to a new example inventory block entity. That is just going to take in blockpos.origin, so that is basically 0, 0, 0. Since we don't want to give it an actual position, we just want to set it at the origin of the world, and then we need to pass in the state that this will take in. So that is just going to be block init.example inventory block, and then we're going to do .get default state, which will just be a default state. So that is all of the data that our block entity is going to hold. And then what we need to do inside of our render method is basically just use this block entity render dispatcher to render our block entity. However, we need to first check that the stack we're trying to render is actually the stack that we want to render, right? So we want to check that this stack is actually our example inventory block. So what we can go ahead and do is first get the item of the stack. So I'm just going to say item is equal stack.get item. That will instantly tell us what the type of the item is. Now we can obviously use that if we want to check if it's our example inventory block. However, I like to do what vanilla does, and that is to actually check first if it's a block item. So what we can do for that is we can say if item is instance of a block item, and I'm just going to call this block item. Then what we can do is get the block, so we can say block is equal block item dot get block. Then we can create a field for the block entity, so we can say block entity, and we can just set that to null, but it doesn't really matter. In fact, we don't actually have to set that to anything, since we're just going to return if it's not correct. So all we can say is if block is instance of our block class, which is example inventory block, then all we need to go ahead and do is set the block entity to be equal to our example inventory block entity that we created as a field up here. And in the case that it is not what we want, then we can just do an else and we can just return. Now once we have our block entity, since in this case we now know that there is a block entity present, what we can go ahead and do is just do this.block entity render dispatcher dot render entity. That is first going to take in our block entity that we just decided on. Then that is going to be our matrices, then the vertex consumers, then the light, and then the overlay. And that is it. That is actually all we need to do for this item renderer class. So obviously I'm just going to write a to-do down here to say render other items, just meaning that in the future you can obviously add more items to this as well. Now what you may want to do, and something I did in my mod, is make a map, and that is a map of a item, so an item here, to a block entity. So that will be a map at the top of the class, and you just have a map of, say, block init.example inventory block dot as item, and that would map that to this dot example inventory block entity. And that means that in here we could just do a very simple map lookup to do this instead of having a big if statement tree here. It's up to you if you like to do it like that or you want to do it some other way, but that will be fine for us. Now obviously, since this is a render method, you can do any of the other things that you would usually do. So you can use your matrices here, you can use the vertex consumers, you can use the light and the overlay if you want to render something with light or overlay. You can obviously get access to any data about the stack you want, so if it has a certain count, then you could maybe render it differently. You can also access the specific transformation modes, so maybe for example in the hand versus in the GUI, GUI, you wanted it to render differently, that's what the Trident does, for example, then you can go ahead and do that as well. I'm not going to worry about any of those. That is completely up to you if you decide to do that, but I'm just letting you know that is how you would do that. You can just use whatever you want in here. You don't have to render an entity, of course. You can render an item, you can render, you know, a fluid, you could render a block, you can do whatever you want, really. But now that is done, the final thing we need to go ahead and do is create a JSON file, and this JSON file will just specify how it should be transformed. So in fact, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll create this JSON file, and then I'll show you what happens if we don't do the rest of the JSON file. So we're going to go into source main resources, and inside of assets.tutorial mod you will need a folder called models, and then inside of there you'll need a folder called item, and you need to make sure that they are called exactly that. So that is models with an S, that is item without an S. Then inside of here we're going to create a new file. Now this will just be the name of whatever your block or item is called, so as the registry name. So for me that is just example underscore inventory underscore block, and that is a .json file. Inside of here, what we need to say effectively, and this is what we need to have, is parent, and we need to say that the parent is Minecraft built-in / entity, and that just tells it that this model will use a dynamic item renderer. So from here we can now go ahead and run the game. So we're going to do that, and I'll show you what happens when we do that, and then we'll make some changes afterwards to reflect what we actually want it to look like. Okay, so as you can see, my game has actually crashed here because I made a little bit of a mistake here in our item renderer. So you just need to make sure that you're not actually defining this as a field. I thought I could get away with it. You can in fact not get away with it because it is initialized too early on. So we actually do need to go ahead and just do that inside of here. So we can just say client dot get block entity render dispatcher dot render entity, and just pass in all of our things like that. So that is just because this class is initialized way too early for us to be able to access this field when it is created. That's fine, that's not really a problem. It just means that we have to call it in here rather than having it as a field. So we should now be able to run the game and it should work perfectly fine. Okay, so we are now inside of the game. Now if we go ahead and grab our item, you'll instantly see it kind of works, but it's maybe not how we want it to look. So you can see first of all in the GUI down here, it's completely flat rather than with obviously a normal block, which is at this kind of angle, and same in the hand as well. So if we look in our first person hand, we can see it's not quite where we want it to be. It's a little bit too big. Same in the offhand, of course. It's not quite right. And then also in third person, it's completely absolutely massive. And obviously if we dropped it on the ground as well, we would see it's way too big. It's going through the ground. That's not what we want it to look like. So how do we just get it to look like, for example, a grass block? Well, luckily it's actually super simple. So I'm not going to close the game. We don't need to close the game. We instead need to come back into our JSON file here, and we need to define some transformations. So these are called the display variables. Now I'm actually going to just copy these in because I'm just using a preset here, and the preset is for a just default block. That is what the preset is called. So I can paste that in like that. And this is basically the transformation. So we're saying that for the third person right hand, it will have a rotation on the X of 75 degrees. It will have a rotation on the Y of 45. It will be translated on the Y by 2.5 and scaled on all sides by 0.375. And these same transformations with obviously different values are applied on the different ones. This is actually meant to be 75, I believe. I somehow messed that one up. But that's not really a problem. Obviously that would be a minor issue, but for the rest of these, those are all fine. And obviously if I now go ahead and build the project, so we'll just give IntelliJ a second to build our project, and if we go now back into the game, and what we can hit is F3 and T, and that will reload all of our resources. And now we can see that this is now scaled to how we would want it to be, right? It's exactly the same as a grass block, albeit a little bit smaller, but that is obviously because our model is a little bit smaller, as you can see. So obviously if you wanted to scale it up, you could. And obviously on the ground, you see that those are now exactly the same. They are, you know, obviously relative to the correct size that they should be. So yeah, obviously if you want to use that default transformation for the block, I have provided that in the description. So I've also provided some other ones as well, for example with the default item, with a default weapon, and also a default rod. So those are kind of the default transformations that I will have provided, and those are all in the description of this video. So yeah, that is it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please do be sure to give it a like and subscribe. If you have a friend that, for example, doesn't know how to make a dynamic item renderer, you could obviously share this video to them and help them out. And yeah, I will see you all in the next tutorial. Goodbye.